What about not just profound thinkers, but thinkers that deliver a powerful idea? For example, utopian ideas of Marx, or utopian ideas, you could say dystopian ideas of Hitler. Those ideas are powerful, and they can saturate all your perception with values, and they focus you in a way where there's only a certain set of actions.
Yeah, right. Even a certain set of emotions as well.
And it's intense and it's direct, and they're so powerful that they completely alter the perception, and the words spring to life.
Yeah, it's like a form of possession. So there's two things you need to understand to make that clear. The first issue is that, as we suggested or implied, that perception is action predicated, but action is goal predicated, right? You act towards a goal. And these propagandistic thinkers that you described, they attempt to unify all possible goals into a coherent singularity. And there's advantages of that. There's the advantage of simplicity, for example, which is a major advantage. And there's also the advantage of motivation, right? So if you provide people with a simple manner of integrating all their actions, you decrease their anxiety and you increase their motivation. Now, that can be a good thing if the unifying idea that you put forward is valid, but it's the worst of all possible ideas if you put forward an invalid unifying idea. And then you might say, well, how do you distinguish between a valid unifying idea and an invalid unifying idea? Now, Nietzsche was very interested in that, and I don't think he got that exactly right. But the postmodernists, for example, especially the ones, and this is most of them with the neo-Marxist bent, their presumption is that the fundamental unifying idea is power, that everything's about compulsion and force, essentially, and that that's the only true unifying ethos of mankind, which is, I don't know if there's a worse idea than that. I mean, there are ideas that are potentially as dangerous. The nihilistic idea is pretty dangerous, although it's more of a disintegrating notion than a unifying idea. The hedonistic idea that you live for pleasure, for example, that's also very dangerous. But if you wanted to go for sheer pathology, the notion that, and this is Foucault in a nutshell, and Marx for that matter, that power rules everything, not only is that a terrible unifying idea, but it fully justifies your own use of power. And I don't mean the power Nietzsche talks about. His will to power was more his insistence that a human being is an expression of will rather than a mechanism of self-protection and security. Like, he thought of the life force in human beings as something that strived not to protect itself, but to exhaust itself in being and becoming. It's like an upward oriented motivational drive, even towards meaning. Now, he called it the will to power, and that had some unfortunate consequences. At least that's how it's translated. But he didn't mean the power motivation that people like Foucault or Marx became so hung up on.
So it's not power like you're trying to destroy the other. It's power, full flourishing of a human being, the creative force of a human being.
Yeah. Well,
way.
You could imagine that, and you could imagine that you could segregate competence and ability. Like, imagine that you and I were going to work on a project. We could organize our project in relationship to the ambition that we wanted to attain, and we can organize an agreement so that you were committed to the project voluntarily, and so that I was committed to the project voluntarily. So that means that we would actually be united in our perceptions and our actions by the motivation of something approximating voluntary play. Now, you could also imagine another situation where I said, here's our goal, and you better help me or I'm going to kill your family. Well, the probability is that you would be quite motivated to undertake my bidding. And so then you might say, well, that's how the world works. It's power and compulsion. But the truth of the matter is that you can force people to see things your way, let's say, but it's nowhere near as good a strategy, even practically, than the strategy that would be associated with something like voluntary joint agreement of pattern of movement strategy towards a goal. See, this is such an important thing to understand because it helps you start to understand the distinction between a unifying force that's based on power and compulsion and one that is much more in keeping, I would say, with the ethos that governs Western societies, free Western societies. There's really a qualitative difference, and it's not some morally relativistic illusion.
So if we just look at the nuance of Nietzsche's thought, the idea he first introduced in Thus Spoke Zarathustra of the Übermensch.
Yeah.
It's another one that's very easy to misinterpret because it sounds awfully a lot like it's about power.
Yeah, right.
For example, in the 20th century, it was misrepresented and co-opted by Hitler to advocate for the extermination of the inferior non-Aryan races.
Yeah, and the dominion of the superior Aryans. Yeah, and that was partly because Nietzsche's work also was misrepresented by his sister after his death. Yeah. But I also think that there's a fundamental flaw in that Nietzschean conceptualization. So Nietzsche, of course, famously announced the death of God, but he did that in a manner that was accompanied by dire warnings, like Nietzsche said, because people tend to think of that as a triumphalist statement, but Nietzsche actually said that he really said something like the unifying ethos under which we've organized ourselves psychologically and socially has now been fatally undermined by the rationalist proclivity, by the empiricist proclivity. There's a variety of reasons. Mostly it was conflict between the Enlightenment view, let's say, and the classic religious view, and that there will be dire consequences for that. And Nietzsche knew, like Dostoevsky knew, that, see, there's a proclivity for the human psyche and for human societies to move towards something approximating a unity, because the cost of disunity is high. Fractionation of your goals, so that means you're less motivated to move forward than you might be because there's many things competing for your attention, and also anxiety, because anxiety actually signals something like goal conflict. So there's an inescapable proclivity of value systems to unite. Now, if you kill the thing that's uniting them, that's the death of God, they either fractionate and you get confusion, anxiety, and hopelessness, or you get social disunity, or something else arises out of the abyss to constitute that unifying force. And Nietzsche said specifically that he believed that one of those manifestations would be that of communism, and that would kill, he said this in Will to Power, that would kill tens of millions of people in the upcoming 20th century. Like he could see that coming 50 years earlier. And Dostoevsky did the same thing in his book, The Demons. So this is the thing that the a-religious have to contend with. It's a real conundrum because, I mean, you could dispute the idea that our value systems tend towards a unity, and society does as well, because otherwise we're disunified. But the cost of that disunity, as I said, is goal confusion, anxiety, and hopelessness. So it's like a real cost. So you could dispense with the notion of unity altogether, and the postmodernists did that to some degree. But they pulled off a sleight of hand too, where they replaced it by power. Now, Nietzsche he's responsible for that to some degree, because Nietzsche said, with his conception of the overman, let's say, is that human beings would have to create their own values, because the value structure that had descended from on high was now shunted aside. But there's a major problem with that. Many major problems. The psychoanalysts were the first people who really figured this out after Nietzsche, because imagine that we don't have a relationship with the transcendental anymore that orients us. Okay, now we have to turn to ourselves. Okay, now if we were a unity, a clear unity within ourselves, let's say, then we could turn to ourselves for that discovery. But if we're a fractionated plurality internally, then when we turn to ourselves, we turn to a fractionated plurality. Well, that was Freud's observation. It's like, well, how can you make your own values when you're not the master in your own house? Like you're a war of competing motivations. Or maybe you're someone who's dominated by the will to force and compulsion. And so why do you think that you can rely on yourself as the source of values? And why do you think you're wise enough to consult with yourself to find out what those values are or what they should be, say, in the course of a single life? I mean, you know, it's difficult to organize your own personal relationship, like one relationship in the course of your life, let alone to try to imagine that out of whole cloth you could construct an ethos that would be psychologically and socially stabilizing and last over the long run. It's like, and of course, Marx, people like that, the people who reduce human motivation to a single axis, they had the intellectual hubris to imagine that they could do that. Postmodernists are a good example of that as well. You don't want everything to be connected to everything else. I mean, that's part of the pathology of the modern world. We're connecting everything together. It's like, that's a little too much connection. It's insanity making, right? We may be driving ourselves mad with the interconnectivity online. You know, it's a great way of educating yourself. It's a great way of having access to information. But I'll tell you, man, it's a great way of being connected to all sorts of things you don't want to be connected to. And it isn't obvious which of those is going to get the upper hand. You know, like it isn't obvious to me that Twitter could be good. See, because I'm afraid that the social, like let's take Twitter, for example. Twitter is speech without responsibility. Speech without responsibility might be fatal. You know, and I'm saying that as an advocate of free speech, but there's a very big difference between free speech on Twitter and the free speech you and I are engaging in right now. Like, you're sitting right there. There's a lot of things that I'm not going to say to you. Like, not because I'm hiding, but like, I'm going to be polite.
There would be an immediate consequence.
There would definitely.
There is no immediate consequence on Twitter.
Well, worse. The consequence of being psychopathic might be positive on Twitter. Right? Whenever the psychopaths get the upper hand, society dies. And it could be, like, I'm afraid of this. I think it's possible that social media enables the psychopaths, fundamentally. It's very worrisome. I mean, there are a lot of bad actors on, well, you know, you read comments, you know, people need a slap.
Yes, they do.
They certainly do. And there's no way of administering said slap. And so one of the consequences of that, for example, many psychological commentators had made this point, Twitter devolves into female aggression. So females, when they're aggressive, they use reputation savaging, gossip, and innuendo. It's unbelievably corrosive because they can't engage in physical combat. And so that makes female antisocial behavior unbelievably pernicious and difficult to regulate. Twitter enables gossip, reputation, savaging, and innuendo, unconstrained. So what does that mean? It means everybody who tilts in that direction has free reign, but it also means that even if you don't tilt in that direction, it's going to tilt you in that direction. So we don't know. These are unbelievably powerful communication systems. You know, you can write something casual that 1 million people will read. Well, maybe you shouldn't ever write something casual that 1 million people should read. Like, maybe that's a reason for it not to be casual. Maybe if we have a technology that enables people to discuss things casually with 1 million people, we just all die. Like, that could be. We have no idea what we're doing with these transformations of communication. We have no idea. It's very difficult to be on Twitter without always feeling like you need to take a shower. You know, and I wouldn't say that I'm at my best on Twitter. Why do I use it? I use it because that's how I keep track of the doings of 700 people that I know. I do it so that I know what's happening in the moment, and that's often where I find my podcast guests. What's the downside? It's easy to say stupid, casual things. And you're immersed in this responsibilityless landscape of casual speech where all the psychopaths come out to play.
It's made, I mean, I don't know if this is what made it, but this is something that I want to get into with you, is the polarization. People have become, I don't know if this is the right word, but almost tribal, it seems like. And, you know, what really, I'm always, every single day I wake up, I'm wondering, how did we get here? Why is the country the way it is? It's not just the country, it's the entire world. Why is the world the way it is now? And you know, kind of where I'm going with this is people have put so much faith into political parties, political candidates. They refuse to look at or admit wrongdoings of anybody that they back. And that's you know, you have the right calling the left sheep, and they're doing the same thing. I could show them 1 million different things of, hey, look at, this is what this person did. And they will dismiss it, and they will make excuses for it, and they put, why has it become so polar? Nobody can, It's like we've lost all critical thinking skills in the world, it seems like to me.
Well, the new technologies flattened the information hierarchy so that everybody can communicate with everyone. Everyone's now a journalist. That might be too many journalists. We've radically expanded the degree to which we're connected with people. And okay, so you can imagine if you're a good person, perhaps that's a good thing. If you're a bad person, it's a really bad thing. A lot of the people that aggregate together online, for example, they wouldn't have a single friend in the actual real world. Mm-hmm. No one would, like your typical basement dwelling, resentful keyboard warrior. It's like if he was left to his own devices without this technological intermediation, he'd have zero impact on anything because no one can stand being around him. But he's magnified madly online and can aggregate with other people. That's what I mean in some ways by the enabling of the psychopaths. So it's not that easy for psychopaths to organize because no one likes them, including other psychopaths. But they can certainly organize. They can certainly organize online. And so we're enabling that. And people are not cognizant of the danger. I've talked to Democrats for 7 years, 50 congressmen, senators, people in positions of authority, RFK, Dean Phillips. I always ask them the same question. When does the left go too far? They never answer. They have no idea. They don't take the fringe seriously. They think, oh, those people don't mean it. It's like, people tend to mean what they say. I know people lie, but often the easiest way to find out what someone's up to is just to listen to what they say. They'll tell you. Hitler told everyone what he was up to. He wrote a whole book about it. Oh, no, he couldn't be up to that. It's like, yeah, pretty much he was up to that. These people who come out and say, we should burn everything to the ground and start again. It's like, that's what they mean. Oh, they don't really mean that. They don't mean that with equity. They don't mean equality of outcome. They don't really mean that. They mean it. They have sway online and far more than is good for us. Is that part of the polarization? I think so. I think the polarization is driven to some degree by the fact that social media enables the psychopaths. So we know what they're like. So we know this is true, by the way, because these people are much more likely to troll post online. So there's been psychological investigations into that. What's the psychological makeup of LOL troll posters? These are people who are doing it for the laughs, doing it for the lulls, just causing trouble. Ha, ha, ha. They're psychopathic. So that means they're predatory parasites. They're narcissistic, which means they want reputation without earning it. They're Machiavellian, which means that they use their words to do nothing but manipulate for their own short-term benefit. And to cap it all off, because that's not enough, they're sadistic, which means they take positive delight in the suffering of others. All right? That's not good. None of that's good. And so you let those people take the upper hand, you're in serious trouble.
The lecture that you gave about how the Bible references itself approximately 65,000 times, and you had a great visual, which
it's a great visual, eh?
It was very captivating, and could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, the first thing we could say is that the Bible is the world's first hyperlinked text, because many of the verses refer to many other verses. And that means it's a very complicated text because you can find your way through it many, many ways. Like the more a text is cross-referenced, the more pathways through it there are. And you can imagine that explodes exponentially. So you might say, well, what does a Bible verse mean? And the answer is, well, it means whatever it means in reference to all of its cross-references. And then each of those cross-references has cross-references. So it's a web of meaning, a very complex web of meaning. And so that's what makes it deep, technically speaking. Okay, so what does that mean? This is a good way of understanding a symbol. See if I can explain this properly. Imagine that you have a belief of any sort. Then imagine that there are other beliefs that are statistically likely to co-occur with that belief, right? So if you believe one thing, here's 4 other things you're likely to believe. And then each of those 4 has 4 beliefs that are likely to occur with them. That's what you'd say if someone was conservative, right? If you know one of their beliefs, you can predict many other beliefs. Or if they're liberal. Every idea, no idea exists independently. It exists in a web of ideas. That web is something like the statistical probability that another idea will co-occur with that idea. That's what the large language models map. They map that mathematically. So here's a way of thinking about it. Imagine a word like hilt, like the hilt of a sword, H-I-L-T. Well, how do you know that's a word? Well, you know the meaning of the word, but you also know it's a word because a word is identifiable because of the statistical regularities between the letters. You know perfectly well that ZQNX is not a word. Why? Well, because there's no word that has that statistical relationship. There's no word that's 4 consonants, not one. You have to have a vowel in your word. So one of the ways that helps you identify a word is your understanding of the statistical regularity between the letters. So the word CILT, that's not a word. But it's quite a lot like a word. It's a lot more like a word than ZQNX. So a word has predictable statistical relationships between its letters. Words exist in relationship to each other. Patterns of words exist in relationship to other patterns of words. Paragraphs exist in relationship to paragraphs. All that's a mathematical domain of statistical regularity. That's what a symbol is. A symbol is the complex of ideas that are associated with a particular idea. And so when you're exploring the symbolic landscape, say, of the biblical stories, you're exploring the statistical relationship between all the ideas. Well, that's a reality, that statistical relationship. It's a reality. It's like, does a witch live in a swamp or a high-rise? Well, a witch lives in a swamp. You know that. Well, why? Well, because in portrayals of witches from time immemorial, witches are likely to be in swamps. So when you think witch, that's one of the things you sort of think along with it. And everything we think is like that. And the part of what the biblical corpus is a walk through, how would you say it? It's a walk through the patterns of character and order that have been reliably observed to exist, to coexist over thousands of years. That's a good way of thinking about it. So here's an example. This is very complicated, but here's an example. So I talked about God. God for Abraham was the spirit of adventure, the call to adventure. So this is a definition. This is very much worth knowing because people have no idea what to do with the concept of God. It's like, God's the call to adventure. That's a definition. Okay, but that's not all. So God for Noah wasn't the call to adventure, not exactly. For Noah, God was the call to batten down the hatches when chaos looms. So imagine that you're a wise man, which is how Noah's portrayed in the story. So you see things straight. You're wise for your time and place, which is how Noah's described. Your eyes are open. And you get an intuition that all hell's about to break loose. And so you take the appropriate precautions. Okay, God is defined in that story as the spirit that comes to the wise to have them prepare in times of trouble. And then the co-occurrence of those stories is the insistence that the call to adventure and the call to prepare are the same thing. That's the monotheism that's underneath it, right? And so what the biblical corpus is doing is aggregating visions of what's highest and making the presumption that they're all manifestations of a unity. Now, the alternative is that it's a plurality, right? I mean, you're going to cope with this one way or another. Like either everything that calls to you morally is the manifestation of one thing in some complex manner, or there's a plurality of moralities. Those are the only options. The monotheistic insistence is that what's highest is, in the final analysis, one thing. So what else? So how else is it portrayed in the Old Testament stories? God is the voice of conscience. That's another portrayal. And so you could say God is the voice of conscience, God is the impetus to prepare in times of chaos, and God is the call to adventure. And that's all the same God. It's just manifesting itself. The same spirit is making itself manifest in different conditions. In the Christian corpus, God is identical with God is the spirit of voluntary self-sacrifice. Right. And that's the same as the spirit of adventure. And that's the same as the voice of conscience. And that's the same as the voice of prudence during times of chaos. It's all the same thing. And I think that's right. I think that's exactly right.
What was the most referenced verse in the Bible? If I remember right, the graph showed.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, actually.
It was very, I love.
See, that's a very good question, because that's actually one way of determining what idea is central, right? Because some ideas are going to be more central than others.
At the bottom of the visual aid, it showed
the length, the number of connections, the number of cross references.
And it was right smack dab in the middle. There was one that had to be at least double the length of all the others.
Yeah, right.
I was just, that would be interesting.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Did you put that together?
No, I found that online. You can find it online if you look up graph of biblical cross references. It'll pop up right away. Something you can probably find for this podcast and show people. Yeah, it's great. It's great. If you want to know something about yourself, sit on your bed one night and say to yourself, you got to mean this. Like, you got to be desperate. This is no game, this. It's like, my life is not everything I want it to be, and perhaps it's not everything that I need it to be. And by need, I mean my life is so unbearable that the suffering that's attendant upon that is make me nihilistic, cynical, bitter, resentful, homicidal, genocidal, unable to have a good relationship, prone to punish people for their virtues because of my jealousy, driving the proclivity to see evil everywhere except within my own heart. Like, these are problems, man. And you ask yourself, you sit on the bed and say, okay, man, I'm ready to learn something. Like, what's one thing I'm doing wrong that I know I'm doing wrong, that I could fix, that I would fix? It's like, you meditate on that, you'll get an answer. And it won't be one you want, but it'll be the necessary one. And it's often something that will point you to small things. So Carl Jung said, people in the modern world don't see God because they don't look low enough. And so imagine you're in your messy bedroom, and you're sitting on the edge of the bed trying to have an honest dialogue with yourself. And the little voice says, it's pretty disgusting in here. And you think, well, I'm way above such trivial niceties as organizing my room. It's like, well, that's pride. That's arrogance. If you're above organizing what's actually yours, how in the world are you ever going to organize anything else? And so you get on your knees and you think, well, it's time to, take a brush to the toilet. And maybe that's where you start. And that works. Like, that works. You start making those micro improvements, like real micro improvements, real on the ground, actual micro improvements to things that are wrong, you'll improve unbelievably rapidly.
What you're talking about there sounds to me a lot like an overdose of arrogance and also the need for humility. Do you think the Western world suffers from arrogance because of our relative privilege and luxury that we kind of overlook?
Of course. Well, that's a temptation, right? I mean, when the radical lefty types go after people for their unearned privilege, they have a point. Now, the point is, the existentialists called it thrownness, which is that's a Heideggerian term. And thrownness is the fact that we kind of experience life as if we're tossed into it, thrown into it. You're male and not female. You're Hindu and not Christian. You're tall and not short. You have an arbitrary range of talents and an arbitrary range of limitations, none of which, in some sense, you chose. It's the cards you're dealt. Now, some of those are cards of privilege. Maybe you're born intelligent. Maybe you're born symmetrical. Maybe you're born healthy. Maybe you're born into a culture where it's much easier not to be absolutely deprived. Maybe your parents are rich. And so all of that in some sense is unearned. Now, along with that comes a good dose of existential guilt, because at the same time, and this is true for anyone, regardless of their cultural background, the ground we walk on is soaked in the blood of historical atrocity. And so that's on you, because, people think, well, who's the Nazi? Well, it's the fascist, or who's the radical communist? It's the radical left-wing ideologue. And the fundamental truth of the matter is that's best dealt with as a spiritual matter, is the adversary is within, really, most profoundly. And so you have to take the responsibility for that historical atrocity onto yourself. I was talking to Guy Ritchie this week about his movie King Arthur. It's quite an interesting movie in many ways. And when Arthur, who could be the hero, takes the sword, he's so overcome by visions of his murderous uncle that he can't pick up the weapon. Well, think about that. Now, you have weapons at your disposal, but they've been used by your murderous uncle. How dare you wield them? And the answer is, maybe it's easy just to leave the sword on the ground, because you do want to be responsible for atrocities going forward, and don't think you couldn't be, and don't think you might not enjoy it. And so the way you pay for your privilege is with your virtue. I mean that most particularly. You have these opportunities and this existential guilt. And the way you expiate that and atone is by doing your best to live the best possible life you can manage, to speak the truth, to treat people with respect, to abide by the principles of the dignity of the individual, and to put your house in order. And that's how you pay for your unearned privilege. All of us. And we all have our privileges and our curses, All of us have that. That's why it's not useful to be envious of people. You're a young man, you see someone drive by in a Ferrari with a blonde, and you think, my God, he's got everything. And, the woman in the car is a prostitute who's got a cocaine addiction, and her life is just one catastrophe after another. And he's had to lie and cheat his way into this position, and he's afraid that everything's going to come crashing down on him. And that's what you're jealous of. And it's just not that profound. You don't want someone else's fate. Man, your fate's enough, and your adventure's enough. It's plenty. It's more than you can ever fully realize. And so that's also part of the reason that we all believe that the individual has some intrinsic dignity. It's, don't be so sure that your position and your room is so damn trivial. It might be your attitude towards it that's trivial. And if you're in dire straits and dire circumstances, just look at how much opportunity you have to make things better. So, not that it's easy. You don't even want it to be easy. So.
On that point of you don't want it to be easy, I've really contended with this idea of struggle and chaos in my life and the role it plays. And once upon a time, I thought I was trying to rid my life of chaos and struggle. Mm-hmm. I thought that's why I was trying to get rich and get the Ferrari and the blonde. I thought that would create a life free of struggle. But then I looked at some studies, and I heard about this thing called gold medal depression, when Olympians come back from the Olympics and they've lost orientation. And then the day when someone offered to buy my company for a nine-figure number, and it filled me with this emptiness and this dread. And I tried to understand the role that struggle would have to play for me to be a fulfilled human being for the rest of my life.
The observation with regard to your company, that's a great observation. I mean, we're built to walk uphill, and when you reach the pinnacle of the hill, you want to stop and appreciate the vision, but the next thing you want is a higher hill in the distance, because it's the uphill climb that it's from the uphill climb that we derive our value. And I mean this technically. So almost all the positive emotion we feel, especially the emotion that fills us with enthusiasm, and that's to be filled with the Spirit of God, by the way, because that's what enthusiasm means. That's experienced in relationship to a goal. And so in some sense, and this is part of the religious enterprise, you want a goal that you can never attain, right? So you can always move closer to the goal that recedes as you move towards it. You think, well, that's frustrating. It's like Sisyphus pushing the rock uphill. But it's not, because as you pursue that goal, you put yourself together and your life does get better and richer and more abundant. And that's why the highest levels of virtue and goal are in some sense transcendent. You want them to be above everything you're doing so you can continually move towards something that's more sublime and better. That's what you are. You're here to live, not to sleep. And the problem with the vision of Mai Tais on the beach is that, well, first of all, that's a vision of drug-induced unconsciousness. Second, it's only going to work for about a week. Third, you're going to be a laughingstock in a month and depressed and aimless and goalless. You want a horizon of ever expanding possibility. And so it does happen to people because they've staked their soul on the attainment of an instrumental goal. And it can be a pretty high order goal. It was in your case. But then you think, well, now I'm there. Now what? Well, the answer can't be, well, I'm going to live in the lap of luxury and never have to leave the face. What do you want to be? A giant infant with a gold bottle? You never have to do anything but lay in your back and suck. It's like, well, you see the problem with that as a conceptualization. It's no, you want to be like an active warrior moving uphill with your sword in hand. And that's dynamic, that's exciting. And that's why so many young men disappear into video games. That's all acted out in the video game. So they have to act that out in their own life. Not that I despise video games, because I don't, but they're not a substitute for life. They might be good training under some conditions for life.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.
What is the belief in God? How does that fit in? What does it mean to believe in God?
Okay, so in one of the stories that I cover in We Who Wrestle with God, which I've only recently begun to take apart, say in the last 2 years, is the story of Abraham. And it's a very cool story. And it's also related, by the way, to your question about what makes communism wrong. And Dostoevsky knew this, not precisely the Abraham story, but the same reason. In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky made a very telling observation. So he speaks in the voice of a cynical, nihilistic, and bitter bureaucrat who's been a failure, who's talking cynically about the nature of human beings, but also very accurately. And one of the things he points out with regards to modern utopianism is that human beings are very strange creatures, and that if you gave them what the socialist utopians want to give them, so let's say all your needs are taken care of, all your material needs are taken care of, and even indefinitely. Dostoevsky's claim was, well, you don't understand human beings very well, because if you put them in an environment that was that comfortable, they would purposefully go insane just to break it into bits, just so something interesting would happen. Right. And he says it's the human proclivity to curse and complain. And he says this in quite a cynic and caustic manner, but he's pointing to something deep, which is that we're not built for comfort and security. We're not infants. We're not after satiation. So then you might ask, well, what the hell are we after then? That's what the Abraham story addresses. And Abraham is the first true individual in the biblical narrative. So you can think about his story as the archetypal story of the developing individual. So you said, well, what's God? Well, in the Abraham story, God is characterized a lot of different ways in the classic religious texts. Like the Bible is actually a compilation of different characterizations of the divine, with the insistence that they reflect an underlying unity. In the story of Abraham, the divine is the call to adventure. So Abraham has the socialist utopia at hand. He's from a wealthy family, and he has everything he needs. And he actually doesn't do anything until he's in his 70s. Now, hypothetically, people in those times lived much longer. But a voice comes to Abraham, and it tells him something very specific. It says, leave your zone of comfort. Leave your parents, leave your tent, leave your community, leave your tribe, leave your land. Go out into the world. And Abraham thinks, well, why? I've got naked slave girls peeling grapes and feeding them to me. It's like, what do I need an adventure for? And God tells them, and this is the covenant, by the way, part of the covenant that the God of the Israelites makes with his people. It's very, very specific. It's very brilliant. He says, if you follow the voice of adventure, you'll become a blessing to yourself. So that's a good deal because people generally live at odds with themselves. And he says, God says, that's not all. You'll become a blessing to yourself in a way that furthers your reputation among people and validly, so that you'll accomplish things that were real and people will know it and you'll be held high in their esteem and that will be valid. So that's a pretty good deal because social people would like to be regarded as of utility and worth by others. And so that's a good deal. And God says, that's not all. You'll establish something of lasting, permanent, and deep value. That's why Abraham becomes the father of nations. And finally, he caps it off and he says, there's a better element even to it. There's a capstone. You'll do all three of those things in a way that's maximally beneficial to everyone else. And so the divinity in the Abrahamic story is making a claim. He says, first of all, there's a drive that you should attend to. So the spirit of adventure that calls you out of your zone of comfort. Now, if you attend to that and you make the sacrifices necessary to follow that path, then the following benefits will accrue to you. Your life will be a blessing. Everyone will hold you in high esteem. You'll establish something of permanent value, and you'll do it in a way that's maximally beneficial to everyone else. And so think about what this means biologically or from an engineering standpoint. It means that the instinct to develop that characterizes outward moving children, let's say, or adults, is the same instinct that allows for psychological stability, that allows for movement upward in a social hierarchy, that establishes something iterable, and that does that in a manner that allows everyone else to partake in the same process. Well, that's a good deal. And I can't see how it cannot be true, because the alternative hypothesis would be that the spirit that moves you beyond yourself to develop, the spirit of a curious child, let's say, what is that antithetical to your own esteem? Is that antithetical to other people's best interest? Is it not the thing that increases the probability that you'll do something permanent? That's a stupid theory.
So God is a call to adventure with some constraints.
A call to true adventure.
To true adventure.
True adventure. Yeah, and then that's a good observation, because that begs the question, what constitutes the most true adventure? Well, that's not fully fleshed out until, at least from the Christian perspective, let's say, that's not fully fleshed out until the Gospels, because the passion of Christ is you could say, this is the perfectly reasonable way of looking at it, the passion of Christ is the truest adventure of Abraham. That's a terrible thing, because the passion story is a catastrophic tragedy, although it obviously has its redemptive elements. But one of the things that's implied there is that there's no distinction between the true adventure of life and taking on the pathway of maximal responsibility and burden. And I can't see how that cannot be true. Because the counter hypothesis is, well, Lex, the best thing for you to do in your life is to shrink from all challenge and hide. Right? To remain infantile, to remain secure, not to ever push yourself beyond your limits, not to take any risks. Well, no one thinks that's true.
So basically, the maximally worthwhile adventure could possibly be highly correlated with the hardest possible available adventure.
The hardest possible available adventure voluntarily undertaken.
Does it have to
It
be
has
voluntary?
to be absolutely.
How do you define voluntarily?
Well, here's an example of that. That's a good question too. When Christ is the night before the crucifixion, which in principle he knows is coming, he asks God to relieve him of his burden. And understandably so. I mean, that's the scene famously in which he's literally sweating blood, because he knows what's coming. And the Romans designed crucifixion to be the most agonizing and humiliating possible. Agonizing, humiliating, and disgusting possible death. Right, so there was every reason to be apprehensive about that. And you might say, well, could you undertake that voluntarily as an adventure? And the answer to that is something like, well, what's your relationship with death? That's a problem you have to solve. And you could fight it, and you could be bitter about it, and there's reasons for that, especially if it's painful and degrading. But the alternative is something like, well, it's what's fleshed out in religious imagery always. It's very difficult to cast into words. It's like, no, you welcome the struggle. That's why I called the book We Who Wrestle with God. You welcome the struggle. And Lex, I don't see how you can come to terms with life without construing it as something like, bring it on, welcome the struggle. And I can't see that there's a limit to this. Like, well, I welcome the struggle until it gets difficult. Well,
so there's not a bell curve, like the struggle in moderation. Basically, you have to welcome whatever as hard as it gets, And the crucifixion in that way is a symbol.
Of that. Well, and it's worse than that in some ways, because the crucifixion exemplifies the worst possible death. But that isn't the only element of the struggle, because mythologically, classically, after Christ's death, he harrows hell. And what that means, as far as I can tell, psychologically, is that you're not only required, let's say, to take on the full existential burden of life and to welcome it, regardless of what it is, and to maintain your upward aim despite all temptations to the contrary, but you also have to confront the root of malevolence itself. So it's not merely tragedy. And I think the malevolence is actually worse. And the reason I think that is because I know the literature on post-traumatic stress disorder. And most people who encounter, let's say, a challenge that's so brutal that it fragments them, it isn't mere suffering that does that to people. It's an encounter with malevolence that does that to people. Their own, sometimes, often, by the way. Soldier will go out into a battlefield and find out that there's a part of him that really enjoys the mayhem. And that conceptualization doesn't fit in well with everything he thinks he knows about himself and humanity. And after that contact with that dark part of himself, he never recovers. That happens to people. And it happens to people who encounter bad actors in the world too. If you're a naive person and the right narcissistic psychopath comes your way, you are in like mortal trouble, because you might die, but that's not where the trouble ends.